So, hello, good evening, everybody. We're welcome to our webinar about understanding ADHD. If you're not sure, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. We'll deal with those D words as we go along. We're not very keen on them. But we've already covered understanding autism and understanding PDA. So this is a third in our series that you will be able to find on our YouTube channel of Reach Out ASC. So Reach Out ASC is a small company in the northwest of England who are a team of teachers, specialist teachers who go out into schools and support children who have autism, ADHD or PDA and other associated conditions. But we work alongside teachers, we get to know the children, we involve parents wherever we can so that we can kind of put the best educational provision together for our young people. We're very much into listening to children and understanding their perspectives, and that is what we believe gives us the best support, ideas and necessary information that we need to be able to do that as we go along. We have a website, reachoutasc.com, where you can get a lot more free resources, articles and information. There's a contact page on there as well if you want to contact us. So let's start. We're talking about ADHD tonight, and there's a lot of myths around ADHD. And one of the first ones that I really want to tackle is that ADHD is about naughty boys. And that is traditionally what has been said. And same with autism in a way. We've often thought that these are conditions that affect boys and also conditions that affect children. So naughty, we're going to take out of this and say it's absolutely a myth. We're going to explore what it really is and look at behaviour through a different lens. Okay, we also know that ADHD comes with a myth about it being bad parenting and that children just need more discipline. Any parent of a child with ADHD will know that discipline and boundaries are important. However, more and more and more of it is not going to meet that child's needs. And bad parenting is a very bad idea to say to anybody because most parents are trying very, very hard to do the best right around their children. I think what we are understanding is that a child with ADHD needs sometimes quite different parenting, different approaches. And it's very hard when parents are judged when it's something that, the child has a different need. There's also a myth around ADHD that the person has no attention. And obviously the word attention is in the title, ADHD, but we're going to explore what attention really looks like in somebody with ADHD. So that is a myth. It's definitely a myth that it's only a childhood thing, that people grow out of it. And I can absolutely testify to that it's adults as well, and it is girls as well. And that's because I have a diagnosis of ADHD. I had it nearly 4 years ago now, after I turned 50. And so it's really important that we know that our children with ADHD will be adults with ADHD, but there's so much potential for them to grow and to learn and to develop in so many ways. Oh, this one's doing something funny. We also hear a lot that children with ADHD are choosing their behaviour or making excuses. Now, to some extent, most children do this at some point or another. But to blame everything that the child does or struggles with on them choosing to be naughty, and there's that naughty word again, is absolutely not the right way to go. So we're going to dispel these myths. But there's one thing that is actually, unfortunately, one of the facts that we come across when we look at ADHD is that someone with ADHD does have a higher likelihood and vulnerability to ending up in prison. And that is often because we're not giving people the right start in life, and that actually being vulnerable to exploitation, being vulnerable to gangs or to criminal activity is often a result of being disassociated from education and help and support and positive life outcomes. So we want to try and flip that over and make it more likely that they're going to be in the set of entrepreneurs, people who are successful, people who can be successful successful in whatever way they want in their lives. And that is wholly possible as well. So, there's been a lot of myths and misunderstanding about ADHD. And even with autism, the same is that because people are judging behavior on what things look on the outside, it's only in the last few years, really, that we've really started to understand the neuroscience and the actual experience of people with ADHD to understand that it is a difference in the way the brain works. And therefore, if we understand that, we can put the right support in place. So what do we know about ADHD? I really there's a few quotes that I always usually start my training with. It's around, the problem with ADHD, says Dan Duncan, that it looks like something it isn't. So it looks like behavior. It looks like somebody might be naughty, or somebody is being really forgetful or losing things. And it's easy to blame that person that they're not paying that attention. And I often say it's people think it is the behaviour, which are often the symptoms of what we see, and blame that person. But it's actually really a processing difference, which we should work with and not against. And we have to respond to how that person's brain works. Another quote from Thomas E. Brown says that it clearly appears to be a problem of willpower failure, but is actually a problem with the interacting dynamics of emotion, working memory, and the chemistry of the brain. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it's really interesting to listen to a little video. Now, there's a lovely set of videos on YouTube called Amazing Things Happen. There's one about autism, there's one about dyslexia, there's one about Down syndrome, and this ADHD one. I quite often use this to introduce what ADHD is to young people, because we find a lot of young people get a diagnosis without being told really what it is. They just think they're broken, they're naughty, they're wrong. So I'm going to play this and I'll bring some aspects out of it afterwards. It's only a few minutes. Here we go.
Pay attention to this important message. Did you get any of that? Well, this is how it feels to be me. I have ADHD, which is short for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a fancy name for people who find it hard to concentrate, remember things, and organise themselves. But who tend to be really curious, creative, and enthusiastic. Imagine your thoughts are planets and your brain is a spaceship. Most people can navigate it easily. They go where they want, when they want, always at the right speed. For example, slowing down to pay attention in class. My ship often feels out of control, like when my teacher is explaining something and a word reminds me of something else, which makes me think of another thing. My brain keeps connecting ideas at top speed till I'm miles away from where I'm supposed to be. My speedy brain can be frustrating because it doesn't always let me think things through before I do them. Then I feel silly and embarrassed. But ADHD can be an advantage for solving problems. If my brain rocket is pointing in the right direction, I can find solutions faster than other people, and I often think of ideas that nobody else has thought of. I need to move so I can think. Fidgeting, rocking my chair, biting my nails, doodling, even talking. The problem is, adults think I'm choosing not to pay attention, when actually movement is my brain's way of helping me so I don't get distracted. Being so energetic can be an advantage too. I love doing practical jobs and I can be very helpful. I'm endlessly curious and keen to try new activities. My teammates see me as brave, but the truth is that my speedy brain doesn't give me time to think about the risks. When I'm doing things I find interesting, my brain works better. Unfortunately, that's not always the case at school. I often get told off when I'm fidgety or when I've forgotten something. It feels like I can never do anything right, which makes me sad and sometimes angry. I'm usually good at making friends because I'm fun to be around, but sometimes children find me annoying when I don't know when to stop and do silly things without thinking. I feel upset when they don't invite me to things. Maybe their parents are worried because they don't understand ADHD. My doctor gave me medication to help my brain organise my thoughts. Medicine doesn't always work for ADHD people, but luckily it worked for me. The doctor also spoke to my parents, who spoke to my teachers, who spoke to my classmates. And now everyone around me understands about my speedy ADHD brain. They help me point my energy in the right direction, they're more patient with me, and we write down instructions so I don't forget things. They encourage me to take movement breaks and help me make lists and charts so I can organise myself better. 1 in 20 people have ADHD, so you probably already know someone like me. Go and find that person and ask them all about their amazing brain.
It's a great introduction to thinking about, ADHD being something that happens in the brain. It's different, and that speediness of it is one thing that's really common. So, one of the things that sorry, we often look at as well is there's been a lot of celebrities, a lot of things on things like TikTok and Instagram about having ADHD, people being diagnosed as adults, and that's been a huge part of the increase in ADHD. And we use these people as role models with some of our young people to say, there is a way that people have navigated their lives with having ADHD, and we can learn from them to navigate that ourselves. It does mean we have to put more effort in sometimes, and it's harder because there's a lot of effort needed to work with a brain when you've in a system that is not set up to working in that same way. But again, it was interesting because I saw Rory Bremner speak at a conference a few years ago, and he recently said, I asked my agent if there were any other ADHD comedians, and his agent had said, I don't know any comedians who are not ADHD. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because often that funniness, that sense of humor, that quick thinking is a real asset if you are a comedian. And all these people in the kind of careers that they have chosen have gone through perhaps some hard times to get there, but actually worked with their brain. There's been studies looking at entrepreneurs, business owners who, have ADHD, and finding ways to work with their brain is really important. So, I don't know all of them. I don't know if you know any, but it's interesting, again, the battle within media about ADHD being overdiagnosed. But the truth is that people becoming more aware. And it's such a relief to know that that explains your brain. We also know that there is a hereditary aspect to it. So it tends to run in families. And often parents are getting diagnosed when their children are, because they realize that there's very lot of similarities. And, I said, I realized through the study that I was doing about autism and ADHD in girls, we can also have the huge amount of masking that happens with autism as well, where you think you've got this persona on the outside that's coping and fitting in, when actually inside there's lots of chaos. We talked about that speedy brain. Some people explain that as having a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. Always makes me smile. Other people talk about having, like 50 TV screens on in the head. So we often talk, when we talk about autism, there's about monotropism, about having needing to be on a single track of thinking. Whereas in ADHD, it's like having lots of tracks all going on at the same time. And ADHD, like autism and PDA, goes across cultures and societies. And, there's lots of stigma in many, many cultures. So I really want to outline that there are people in different areas that are talking about ADHD within their own culture. So there's great some links there that you can look at to find out a little bit more about that. Particularly useful for us as teachers as we work with children, maybe from a different cultural background, so that we can find ways of talking to their parents or their teachers within that context. The other thing about ADHD is not only just ADHD, often there's other conditions that go with that as well. And it could be things like anxiety and depression, tic disorders, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, autism, and ADHD are now commonly looked at together. So, the most important thing about that is to remember each person is an individual. And there's often a connection with, especially as people get older and into adulthood, they might have had trauma that has also affected the way that they perceive life and the way they regulate their emotions. So we need to know the whole person. And understand some of the things that might go along with ADHD as well. But it could be just ADHD as well. In the DSM criteria for ADHD, there's these 18 points. And if you notice, they're all quite negative. It's all about things that they can't do or things that you maybe, are difficult behaviors. The diagnostic process is to do a whole history of the child, and every area is different in diagnosis. However, there's usually they say there's three types of ADHD. So there's predominantly inattentive. So the most of the characteristics will be from that inattention list. Sometimes it's called ADD, attention deficit disorder. Predominantly hyperactive or impulsive. I can honestly tell you I've never come across that, so I don't know what they call it. But there's often, and most common is the combined type, which is the ADHD. So there's inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. However, like we're realizing about autism, ADHD, and PDA is that it doesn't describe all that's going on in an ADHD brain. There's a lot more going on. So let's have a look at that as well. So let's start with those D words, deficit and disorder. I'm quite insulted on behalf of myself and other young people that I know that, that's kind of very prominent words in here. Yes, there are challenges, and yes, there are different ways brain works that can actually cause some difficulties. But if we start with the word difference instead, let's look at that, how that develops in a person with ADHD. As you say, we often think that it's hereditary. So, usually, somewhere in somebody's family, there's somebody with very similar characteristics, and it affects everybody differently. So, again, like everybody will have a different profile. But let's start with that word attention. A person with ADHD doesn't have no attention, they often have too much attention, or variable attention, as it's sometimes called. So, what's happening in the brain is that it needs a chemical called dopamine, and there are some others that go with that, to be able to make sure the links in your brain, in your neurons, follow through from the beginning of a thought right through to its end. And that is carried by dopamine, serotonin, making feel satisfied at the end of that thought process or that activity. So, dopamine is a really key chemical in the brain. So, in ADHD, they seem to think there is not enough dopamine or it's not working efficiently. This means that the ADHD brain needs to seek out dopamine in order to have the attention and the focus that it needs to be alive and to be able to do something and carry out an activity or pay it, a conversation even. So the brain is looking for something that will create that dopamine. Now you might hear it as a thing on TikTok or Instagram, oh, get my dopamine fix. But it's a lot more complicated than that. It's about finding something that makes your brain work well and do the things you want it to do. It's not as simple as having a fix, or a high. It's actually, I need to be able to do this task, and I'm not going to be able to do it unless my brain is interested enough to be able to get enough dopamine to do it. So it's an interest-driven brain, and it is also variable attention. Now, what happens is boredom can come along, and boredom is probably the enemy, I often say, with ADHD, because boredom starts to shut the brain down. The brain isn't getting enough dopamine, it's bored, and therefore it can't pay attention, and it's really difficult to work through boredom. Now, impulsivity links to that obviously, in terms of when the brain is starting to shut down or getting bored, something that will give a fix of dopamine is there and it reacts impulsively. So it might be kind of fidgeting with something, it might be touching something, it might be acting without thinking. But often the thought process happens afterwards. It's not a person with ADHD can't see the consequences. It's just that they don't come to mind at that time. So a lot of the impulsivity leads to a lot of being told off, getting in trouble. But for the person with ADHD, they know when they should or shouldn't do something. They just haven't been able to stop themselves doing it at that time, and it often can lead to a lot of shame, embarrassment, and self-depreciation afterwards as well. Sometimes though it can be wonderful doing something impulsive, going out on a day out, or trying something new, or speaking to somebody you've never spoken to before can actually be a really interesting thing. So impulsivity doesn't always have a negative effect. In fact, probably most entrepreneurs who have ADHD will say that's how they created their company or whatever. And so it's really interesting. I will tell you too that these webinars started off as an impulsive response to something. So there you go. Sometimes it works out really well. But I think for a person with ADHD, the drive of the brain to try and find something interesting, especially when they're maybe overloaded or bored, can take a lot of the energy. And it's like, don't please try not to say to a person with ADHD, especially a child, that they're not trying, because they are probably trying harder than anybody else to try and keep that focus, try and keep on track. And it's a constant battle and a war within their brain to be able to do that. So looking at the other side, the hyperactivity side. So we looked at attention and impulsivity. The hyperactivity again is linked to the brain, and the hyperactivity is linked to sensory dysregulation. Just last week, I read a research paper that said that people with ADHD can have as many sensory regulation problems as somebody with autism, and I think that's probably why we're seeing a lot of crossover. And what it is your whole central nervous system is linked to your brain, to your body and your senses. And therefore, when that information comes in from the world around you, or you're trying to deal with internal sensations, then your brain has to manage that. And if it isn't got the attention or the focus for it, then it can dysregulate. It's really interesting because we actually have 8 sensory systems, which we're going to look at in a minute. And for people with ADHD, they can be oversensitive. So I'm really commonly hearing oversensitive to noise. So busy rooms and paying attention in that is really hard. Or smells. I get a lot of smell sensitivity in young people with ADHD. So sensory dysregulation is really common, and it's often under registered with people who support people with ADHD. It's often not seen in reports on EHCPs. It's really important to know that your ADHD person could have a lot of over responsive or under responsive hyperactivity as well. Now, there are our internal sensations around movement. And I think one of the big things that comes across with ADHD is that a person's very fidgety, always wanting to move. And in the video, she said, I need to move in order to think. I mean, right now I'm talking to you, my arms are pumping away, my hands are moving because that helps me think. But that hyperactivity can be quite subtle and it can be internalized as well. So it's not always that the child is falling off the chair or can't sit still or climbing, which can happen, but it can also be the person is sitting there desperately trying to contain like a volcano inside them. But also the hyperactivity can take place in the brain. And I talked about having those 50 TV screens on and somebody else is in charge of the remote control, flicking from one to another, which is why often sensory dysregulation happens and sleep difficulties and things like that. So hyperactivity is a big part of having ADHD. It's linked to all the other things, and it's definitely linked to sensory systems. Now we have a sensory system called interoception. and that is our internal organs. So our central nervous system connected to our internal organs. That tells us whether we want to go to the toilet or, whether we're hungry, whether our heart beating really fast or we're hot or cold, things like that. And those internal organs also give us feedback about our emotions. And again, for ADHD, people with ADHD can have emotional dysregulation as well. And that is often maybe their emotions feel really huge to them, or they come on quite suddenly. And again, that's linked to their sensory systems. Interestingly, I'm just going to backtrack a little bit because I forgot to say about attention. There are times when a person with ADHD can hyper focus and be absolutely concentrated and focused on something they're really interested in. And, even forget their sensory systems and forget to eat or go to the toilet. And that's part of the attention variability as well. So don't forget that as well. And often people say, oh, well, they can do this, but they can't do that. Well, check how bored or interested they are, and that probably will give you the idea. Right down at the bottom, it says about executive functions. Now, this again isn't in the diagnostic criteria, but what we're learning is that executive functions are a huge part of having ADHD. Executive functions are the frontal lobe of your brain that sorts out how you organize and plan and carry out a task. Now, it's already difficult for a person with ADHD to carry out a task because their attention is easily distracted unless they're really hyper focusing on it. So already executive functions are kind of disabled a little bit by that. But also we're finding in neuroscience that executive functions can take longer to develop. So there is a developmental delay in that area of the brain in ADHD. So that means, you think, oh, an 8-year-old should be able to do this, that, and the other. And that person with ADHD will find those tasks really difficult. So there's a double whammy there. There's the attention to be able to carry out the task and enough dopamine to do that, but there's also the organization skills that have not yet developed. And to be quite honest, I would say that's probably as an adult the most disabling thing for me having ADHD is the amount of effort and work and scaffold I have to put around those executive functions is huge and could take a lot more effort on a daily basis than, if you haven't got ADHD, you'll never understand. So, working memory is also affected in that. And that is often why people with ADHD lose things, forget things, stop a task halfway through because they've forgotten what they were doing. I know we all, go upstairs and forget what we're going for. But what if you're doing that every day, 3 times, loads of times a day? And what happens is lots of people with ADHD will build strategies around this. They'll find ways of doing it. And as parents, teaching those strategies, coaching your child through those are going to be really important. So here are those sensory systems. So again, you can go to our website and look at our articles for a little bit more information about this. But think about your person with ADHD and ask them about their sensory systems. Now, the thing that I realized after quite a while is that what is normal for me is not normal for other people. So I have a very, very sensitive sense of smell, and and I can't understand why people can't smell the things I do. I'd be quite good down a mine, wouldn't I? Or doing perfume. But there are some smells I really like, and I can smell, the lilac in our garden at the moment and really enjoy it. But it's understanding that there are different ranges for everybody and what the range for your person is. There's also skills like balance, and some of our people with ADHD are fantastic at sports and they're really good at balance and body awareness. And proprioception is about where your body is in space, but also the feedback to your brain from your muscles and your joints. And honestly, so many of the young people I work with say when they need to move, it's like their bodies or their muscles are fizzing. and they have to move. They just can't stop still. There's this like latent energy that's fizzing inside them. So again, please don't tell them off when they have to move, but find maybe safe ways and regular opportunities to do that. This is where sports and activities and things that really use their muscles, resistance stuff, can be really, really helpful. And there at the end is the interoception that I talked about. So when you've got a child who's got very big emotions and seems to be very emotional, what it means is that they're struggling with those big physical feelings inside their body when they get an emotion. So all that information helps us, and helps the person themselves. So it's so important to teach this to a person who has ADHD so that they can learn to regulate that, and you can learn to come alongside them, and what we say is co-regulate. Come alongside, first of all, understand, and then help them through that. It can be quite overwhelming, and at other times, you say, it can be a joy, a pleasure. My sense of smell when I go out in the countryside and I can smell the hawthorn on the hedges, and when other people can't, is just a joy. So we've got to remember that it's that huge balance. Sometimes when we're feeling sluggish, or your person with ADHD is slugging, switching off, seeming to zone out, sometimes a sensory activity can build up their alertness. And again, especially if it's something interesting as well. So there's more information on our article there. So what we're looking at is helping a person to be in a kind of calm and alert state so they can tolerate the environment, any kind of instructions or demands, and interaction with people. If they're over responsive, the brain is trying to work too hard to calm things down, and you can get all kinds of different kinds of behaviors that give you that kind of clue. And if they're under responsive, then you can get a lot of maybe sluggish, or needing to move, sensory seeking work as well. Now, these sort of things are really recommended a lot of the time, aren't they? The sensory kind of activities, fidget toys, body balls, yoga stuff, wobble cushions, headphones for people with ADHD. But why do they work? I think it's really important to understand that the person themselves needs to know why they are working. So when we talk about our sensory systems and the person understands them, then they can say, okay, so when my muscles are fizzing, if I do something that resists, so like a resistance yoga band sort of thing, that will calm that fizzing down. Or if I'm overwhelmed by too much noise and I put headphones on, that cancels out some of the noise, and you can get those little earbuds that do the same. And if at home and I need to bounce, maybe it's easier to bounce on a yoga ball than on your settee, and so on. So there's lots of ways that children and adults can make sensory adaptations in order to be able to cope with the daily onslaught of that better. And I always say, when they're working, please don't take them away. Don't say, oh, you don't need them now. Just have them always available. Because again, even as an adult, there are things that we need to be able to use in order to learn our own regulation. So I mentioned executive functions, and I just wonder, to give you an illustration, if you could think about just even having a shower in the morning. Now, I will again talk a little bit about my experience of this. I can't have a shower in the morning very often because the amount of executive functions involved are just huge. So I often have a bath or a shower at night because that's easier. I've got more time. So one of the executive function is a difficulty with the awareness of passing of time. And it's amazing how common that is in people with ADHD. So there are people that are often very late all the time, or maybe always early. But in having a shower, you've got to make lots of decisions and steps using your executive functions in order to do it. So you've got to decide, well, do I need a shower? Where, have I got a clean towel? Have I got enough shampoo? Is everything I need in the bathroom? And what are those things? Is there somebody else in the shower? Have I got time enough to have a shower? What am I going to wear afterwards the shower? Where am I going to put my wet towel? What clothes am I going to wear? And what order am I going to put them in? Every single one of those is a step the brain has to work out. Now, for those of you who just get up, have a shower and don't even think about it, congratulate yourself on being able to do that. Because if you've got ADHD, those sort of daily things just become sometimes huge mountains to climb, and you might get lost in the middle of it and just leave all your clothes on the bathroom floor because you've just forgot, your brain has not kept hold of that information. I need to pick those up. And we often put such a lot of pressure on children to organize themselves and to get ready for things. And then we just end up having to, tell them off for not doing or losing their way. When actually, if we just looked at it through the lens of, I wonder if their brain cannot process that, then we can actually say, okay, let's first of all cut down the steps. So for having a shower, have a bag ready that has all the things in you have for a shower, or make sure that there's always things in the bathroom you need. Have all the things to put your dirty laundry in the bathroom, so that's easier. So you can make all those little adjustments to just make the whole task easier. You can change the time of day that you do it, because at night you've got more time. You're not having to get out of the house to go somewhere. Um, and when I have a shower, it's like, oh my now, ow, I have got to sort out what I'm doing with my hair, and that's another set of tasks to do. Now, of course, my hair's okay today, I do it. But I think it's really important to think about your own sort of daily routines and how maybe obvious they are to you, that they might not be obvious to your young person who has ADHD. And they're often just getting into trouble for things that they can't help. But we can help them. We can think, yes, let's help make this task a little bit easier. Maybe write them a list, maybe do, if they're very young, do it in visuals and walk through it with them. Let them do the last thing so that they're successful. And if you need to be helping your young person a bit longer when they're a teenager to do their daily care routine, that's okay too. The routine will really help. So executive functions, this lovely list here, is really important to think about how is this affecting that person with ADHD every single day? And if they've got to kind of do nearly all of them all at once, how difficult is it for them? And it could be that they manage all day at school, but then when they get home and they're supposed to do homework and there's nobody there to scaffold that for them, that they've just no brain power to do anything about it. So again, work with that, work about making it simpler and successful before you start building up the expectations. There's another thing that thinking about the interest driven as well. Executive functions work better when the brain is interested. So we do something what we call kind of cognitive stacking. So you put an interesting activity alongside a boring one. So even something simple like listening to a podcast or a piece of music or some music while you're having a shower can be really, really helpful. I had a young person who had never done any revision. He was in year 11, and at the beginning of the year I talked about cognitive stacking, and he said, well, what do you like doing? He said, I love mountain biking. I said, well, can you listen to revision? I said, if you talk your revision into your phone and listen to it when you on your mountain bike, maybe that'll help. And I saw him a few weeks later and he said, you know what? I've done revision for the first time in my life. So again, we're just working with the brain, and we're working with the executive functions support that they need in order to be able to get things done. So, look at them as, yes, they will cause difficulties, but there are ways through. And as adults, and most ADHD adults that I know, and I know a lot now, will find that they need to be able to support their executive functions in everyday life, in their work, in their job, in their relationships, in their parenting, because these are the things that are probably the most disabling thing in ADHD. And yet, they're never assessed in the ADHD criteria, which is a little bit worrying now. Okay, I'm going to also move on and say something about rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Again, it's a new area of understanding in ADHD, and we can this piece of research from ADHD Attitude magazine is a really good resource to look at. But they talked about the shame that arises from the repeated failure to meet the expectations from parents, teachers, friends, and the world. And often those things are given with negative messages. Stop doing that. Don't do it. You know, you're being naughty. You're choosing that behavior and so on. And that builds up. And so they said it's estimated that they receive 20,000 more negative messages by the age of 12 than those without the condition. And I often bring this up in secondary schools when children are really disengaged from education. They might be very oppositional, kind of having a lot of behavior difficulties. And this will have started in primary school, when they're told all the time that no, stop, you're doing it wrong, and so on. So we've really got to flip that round and build them up in a very different way. If you want to, this webinar doesn't talk about the actual strategies. If you want to know more, have a look at our website. There's some articles on there. But I think this is really important because what it often gives rise to is something that is being called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And that is where the person who with ADHD reacts as if with huge panic or dread at any kind of being told off, making mistakes, or even a perceived somebody doesn't like me. And to some people kind of internalize that and become maybe real people pleasers so that people won't reject me. And others may become quite oppositional. Well, you don't like me, you're never going to like me, and therefore, and it's kind of that pushback. So again, it's a really important area to know about, because if you're getting those kind of behaviors from your young person or your adult that who has ADHD, then it's really important to look at the trauma that this creates, and really important that we build them up with positive understanding of who they are. And for some, just the relief of knowing that they've got an ADHD brain can really help that as well. There's a lot that we don't talk about in masking in ADHD, and this is not just girls, boys can do it as well, but as in autism, it's more common in girls. And with girls, you get that kind of, copying what somebody else is doing so that they don't show that they've missed what the teacher was saying. They may be very daydreamy, maybe zone out, but also they could be really helpful people pleasers, very caring, because that is a way of avoiding that kind of rejection sensitivity and being found out, for struggling or losing things all the time or whatever. So it's really interesting. The other way it can come out is I've always been early, instead of that time blindness that can come through that. So parents, the good news is there are starting to be more parenting courses for children with ADHD. I've seen a really good one from Care for the Family, but only certain areas do offer that. But there's been work by Dr. Russell Barkley. You can find him online and on YouTube. And I think, there are things you need to do. And if you've got ADHD yourself as a parent, there will be some challenges for you as a family to maybe put things in like routines or lists and things like that to do help. But I think the main message is be kind to yourself. It's okay to be an ADHD family, and it's okay to do things differently that works for your family. The trouble is, isn't it, the tutting and the judgment from other people. But if you get some research done and you look at people like Dr. Russell Barkley and others who are about that positive parenting and support for your young person, then you can find your own strength to get through that, I think. So we need to talk about medication, and it's a really interesting area. Not all people have medication, not all people want medication, and it doesn't suit everybody. However, on the other side, ADHD medication is one of the most tested and safest medications in the whole world because there's been a lot of research around it. One of the things that often, to have the medication offered is usually needing a diagnosis. So obviously somebody waiting on a long diagnostic list won't be able to access this. But what it isn't is magic, and what it isn't is a cure. I think it's really important to read and understand what medication does. So, very simply here, it is a stimulant and amphetamine based medication. And what it does is it works by increasing the activity of those neurotransmitters like the dopamine, the serotonin, and the others within the brain. So, what it does is allows the brain to work more fluently. Now, again, the dosage has to be right for each person in order to do that. But often, when I talk to children about their medication, I say, "What's it for?" "Oh, it's to make me behave better." I think we've got to be so careful that we educate children about the dopamine, the serotonin, and so on, but also what the medication does. There's some great resources by the ADHD Foundation in Liverpool that I will put on the resource list that explains medication. And I like the young children's advice around it being like in your brain there's a postman and he's got a huge bag of post and he's so busy running around that he kind of drops off the post and only some of it gets delivered. That's kind of like your brain trying to keep hold of its attention. However, the medication is like having extra postmen in your brain, which helps that messages get across. So what we often do is make sure that when we're tracking medication with children, is that we do look at the kind of not the behavior change, but can they achieve some tasks? So again, we're asking, can they think through a task? And this is one again from the ADHD Foundation. You could make your own version. But if you're asking teachers or you're tracking the medication at home, getting the child involved is really important. But if they know that this medication is supposed to help them get things done, and that also remember they might have a bit of side effects as well. So it can affect their appetite, it can also affect sleep, but it can also have like um, a backlash, I suppose, afterwards. So as it wears off, then they can get fizzy. That's why we say it, isn't it? Medication only stays in the system for as long as the medication is supposed to last, so usually 4 or 8 hours, and it doesn't stay in the system. So it's why when somebody can have a break for it. So some adults might only use it at work or for particular projects. Children need to be taught about what it is and be given some agency because I see a lot of teenagers getting to the point where they don't want to take it because it doesn't make them feel right. And getting the dosage right is really important. There's usually a huge growth spurt in teenage years, so they need to have an adjustment anyway to their medication. So it's only a little bit of an overview of medication there, but I hope it kind of gives you the idea it's not a behavior pill and it's not a cure. It's just an aid to that thinking and tracking thoughts, which can be enormously helpful. It can calm down some of the noise in the brain, some of the overload. It can help sensory regulation and emotional regulation because of those thought processes being helped. But again, it's very individual. The other thing that can happen is sleep difficulties are very common in ADHD, and not all do. Some people are like wind up toys, they wear themselves out all day and then just fall asleep. However, many people with ADHD say that it's really, really difficult to get to sleep. And again, it's not always connected to poor routines or screen time, although they will have an effect. But it's a brain's hyperactivity at this point. So often children will, you'll be trying things like cutting out things and calming everything down, going very quiet maybe. But we often find that when they go to bed, nothing has calmed the brain down. Sometimes alternatives help. I have known people with ADHD saying coffee helps them go to sleep. Now, that wouldn't work on me at all because it makes me fizz. But other people have said coffee really helps. So, again, it's different for everybody. Some people use white noise, some people listening to a story or a podcast can help. So, it helps the brain go on one track rather than having all these other kind of bright lights shining in their head. One thing that's been quite successful with parents I've worked with is exercise before bedtime, or some real kind of rough and tumble or resistance type activity, and exercise, excuse me, such as maybe bouncing on a trampoline. Now, again, you might think for some children that might make them a bit more hyper, so you wouldn't do that, but experiment. And there's some great information on, again, around Chad and Attitude magazine around sleep. Some people with ADHD need to have a different, I think they call it a circadian rhythm. So their body clock is very different. And that can cause a lot of problems as well. So sleep will be something you will have to maybe tackle. And again, person by person, over time, finding the best way through that. But think about those natural things around good food. So again, there's research around ADHD about having a good balanced diet is really helpful as well. And at that point, I also want to say that sugar can mimic dopamine. And so it's very common to kind of have a sugar addiction and processed food addiction in ADHD. This is why, again, building in a varied diet and using maybe natural ingredients can be helpful. Some people say, and again, there is some research around using fish oil because that's related to the brain, but then none of those are cures. What they might do is calm down some of the symptoms. Um, and it's different for everybody. Hormones really affect girls and women with ADHD as well. And the research around ADHD and menopause and perimenopause is starting to really ramp up. I can personally vouch for how much my brain just went to mush when perimenopause fit in, because again, estrogen is really important in part of dopamine. So girls who are menstruating, going through puberty, can have a real change or be affected by ADHD a lot more. And at some point as well, that puberty for boys will affect their ADHD, the differences in their brain. So it's all information to be aware of as we get to know more and more about ADHD. So really, what we try and do is say when we have got behavior that is challenging us, and is probably quite challenging to the person themselves, is to kind of sit and maybe draw an iceberg. Because what we want to do is look at what's going on beyond underneath it, and not just if we do just like cause and effect, or you've done this and so you're punished, you'll never get to the root of really how that behavior can change and how that person can grow through understanding themselves. So when they're young children, we have to do a lot of this with them, a lot of co-regulation. But we can write down the behaviors at the top there, above the waterline of what we see, and then start to consider, the stress the person is under, the demands, are they bored? Have they had gaps in their skills because at that time when that thing was taught, they weren't able to pay attention or it didn't stick in their memory? Are there some executive function barriers? It's really hard when you should be able to do something, but your brain is really struggling to do it, and you can feel a lot of shame with that. Are they being impulsive and then again feeling that they shouldn't have done that and getting themselves into something that is difficult to get out of? There's one thing around I want to say as well about lying, and it's really interesting. This is an article I read on Attitude magazine that in ADHD, there are kind of three main reasons why somebody might lie. And one of them is that it's just impulsive. That's the first thing that came into my head and said it. And now I realize that was a lie. So therefore, I'm going to have to make that plausible. So it gets complicated. The second reason is that the story is really boring. So if I build a bit of extra bits of information in that story, it's going to sound great. Yeah. So that's kind of, that need. And the third need, again, is avoiding that shame and rejection sensitivity. So it's kind of a fear of being rejected if I say the truth. Often, if you ask, an example is asking a child, have they tidied their room? And they say, oh, yes. Well, that's a delay tactic, isn't it? Or no, it's also that fear of getting told off because they know they haven't done it. It's much better to think, okay, why haven't they been able to do their room? Have they forgotten? Have they not got the executive functions to be able to carry that task out? Can we break it down for them? It may be that you do a little bit every night and each night is a different task. All those sort of things can really help. So always be thinking too, is your child with ADHD anxious? And anxiety can look like a lot of things. And it can look like being explosive or oppositional. It can look like winding people up and being the class clown because that's the only way you know to get a response from people. Sometimes it can look like meltdown and crying, but sometimes it's quite hidden. And like people who are autistic, then we can have that Coke bottle effect. Particularly those who mask, they might mask all day at school, but all those challenges are shaking up that bottle. And when they get home, the first thing that their sibling says to them, makes it all kind of explode. And I think it's really important to understand that anxiety also can be a big part of that a person with ADHD's life. Again, linked to that rejection sensitivity, linked to that fear and shame of letting people down and not living up to people's expectations, but also linked to that impulsivity. What am I going to do next? Because, often the self-control, as you say, it's not just about willpower. We said that right at the beginning. It's about support and strategies and understanding. So this was a webinar that I listened to on YouTube, Beyond Oppositional Defiance Disorder. Often children with ADHD are often diagnosed with ODD, and I've always had my own particular doubts about that. And again, I just think the children I've seen who have been labeled with ODD are often have all this kind of rejection sensitivity. They had trauma, they might have been in care, or they might have been rejected from so many schools. And I think we've got to really unpick what's going on behind it, because again, as I said earlier, maybe they're being oppositional because they've been rejected so often, and that's what they think people think of them, and their chances in life. It's interesting when you look at entrepreneurs and you look at people who have been successful with ADHD, it's amazing how many of them say there was somebody along the line who believed in me. And I just think I really want to be that person for the young people that I meet and get you and speak to, because that if that is the thing that could change their life, that's what we want to do. Interestingly as well, and I'm not going into the strategies, but there's been a shift from, making rules and making children stick to them to actually coaching them, and coaching adults as well, in strategies and support and understanding and setting their own goals and using their own motivation, that cognitive stacking. So there's a great lot of support out there now. And as we get to know more about ADHD, there's more things that are possible that we can do. So, one of the things we do is help children break things down into look for things that are positive. So this is a typical thing I've done for some children around playtime, when, it can often end up when the child with ADHD kind of either, crashing the line or falling out with somebody. And what we use something like this for is to look at the bigger picture and say, actually, not everything was bad in playtime. Maybe walking into class was a bit messy and you bumped into somebody, but hey, all the rest of it was really good. So what we're trying to do is provide ways of doing positive reinforcement, looking at the bigger picture, seeing what was good, and then minimizing the bit that maybe has gone wrong. Again, usually our experiences of people, children with ADHD, are that they're always getting into trouble. So we've got to put some effort into breaking that down and finding out what's really going on. So as we finish, here's another little video just to finish off. This again is one of my favorites. It's from a YouTube channel called How to ADHD. Really good for those teenagers who are exploring ADHD and adults. But you know, it's something that we live with and that we can celebrate and overcome. Here we go.
I asked people with ADHD one question. What do you want the world to know about your ADHD?
This is what I want you to know about my ADHD. It takes me a lot of hard work to get my work turned in on time. I'm very smart, but my grades drop sometimes.
If I could actually sit down and start my homework, I would. But many days I just can't, and struggling with something so seemingly simple tends to make me feel very frustrated or even stupid.
I'd like the world to know that there are people like me out there who get good grades, rarely get in trouble, and yet can and do have ADHD and struggle with the symptoms that come along with it.
Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it isn't there.
My ADHD affects every aspect of my life, from sleep to school to work, all of my relationships, and I have to tailor my entire life around having it.
It doesn't always look the same. I was only diagnosed at 25 because I have the inattentive type.
I'm basically hyperactive. I was diagnosed at the age of 7.
I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until I was 38, so I always thought you need to be hyperactive to have it.
I've filmed this video too many times now, and I can't get it right, and it's really stressing me out now.
I try really hard, and it hurts when people act like I'm not trying as hard as I am.
But the worst part is when my symptoms aren't taken as symptoms, they're taken as behaviors, done intentionally to upset someone, or considered that I don't care, and that's never been the case.
Whenever you think that I intentionally tried to hurt you, I didn't. I probably just screwed up.
I'm at least as frustrated as you, and probably even more.
When I say I forgot, I'm not lazy. I'm not just trying to make an excuse. It's a real struggle, and I'm probably even more pissed off at myself than you are at me.
There is a giant flipping war going on inside this head. I really am trying.
When I use my accommodations, it's not me trying to take the easy way out. All I'm trying to do is level the playing field so that you and I have a lot more even chance of success.
When you see me arranging my pens and pencils according to color, it's because my brain is trying to compensate for the chaos within.
I squeeze some Play-Doh in my hand and let me concentrate on what I'm doing. I moved to a special spot in the classroom for tests because I can't block out noises and distractions like you can.
While I'm staring off into space, it doesn't mean I'm stupid.
It doesn't mean that I'm not listening to you.
Normally it means that you've triggered a really interesting thought which my impulsive brain can't help but chase.
Having ADHD is like having a billion trampolines in your head, each representing a thought, and your brain just jumping off each and every one every second.
I don't think about ADHD as a disorder. I take it as more of a different way of thinking.
I know my brain works differently, but ADHD can give me an advantage with what I'm doing.
It may take me a while to come to a solution. It tends to be really different than everybody else's, and a lot of people appreciate that.
I've been told my whole life I need to be fighting my brain. I'm learning now that I need to love and work with my brain.
It's not an excuse, it's an explanation, and it's something that I'm going to continue working on for the rest of my life, and that's okay.
I'm smart, but ADHD makes focusing hard and hides my capabilities. If I'm given the chance, I can achieve more.
To meet this amazing community and learn more about how to support them, please visit howtoadhd.com/howtohelp. Please share.
Also, sticky notes. Yay!
Oh, sorry. I just always smile at the end of sticky notes. Anybody who knows me knows that I have millions of sticky notes, and the color coding is one of the best strategies to help me get organized. Okay, so I've mentioned Attitude Magazine today and ADHD Foundation and How to ADHD. There's more out there, and certainly, you know, look for somebody who understands and is positive about ADHD. There's been too much negativity for so long. And I think this is a wonderful explanation about how amazing our ADHD young people can be, and adults, is that, you know, the education system and all sorts of systems try and fit people in a box. This is a puzzle that I often carry around with me when I go into schools. And one of my students decided they weren't going to put it into the box. They were going to make this wonderful sculpture instead. And actually, I think that really sums up how great our ADHD children can be. and what they can contribute to the world. So thank you so much, everybody. And I did say it's a whistle-stop tour. That is the end of this presentation. I'm going to stop recording.